I've been waiting to make this video for ages. Testing new clays and glazes doesn't always go particularly well, but for once I'm so pleased with the finished results. But more on that later. To begin with, I'm going to do a quick recap on the throwing and trimming of these pots, but with the focus being on the clay mixture, the inclusions and the glaze, I guess, as that's the interesting part. For these vessels, I'm going to be using this red stoneware clay body, which is very coarse and gritty, so I'll be mixing it down by 50% with a high iron stoneware clay body that's much smoother, making it a bit easier to throw, and perhaps less likely to dunt or crack once fired, as I have experienced that before when using this red stoneware by itself. It comes in its own sealed bag, as this stuff is incredibly messy. Not only that, but due to how coarse it is, it dries out tremendously fast, and if not wrapped up properly, it doesn't take long for this clay body to become too hard to work with. Anyway, I get flashbacks to my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond whenever I use this stuff. I must have spent hours cleaning up a studio spattered in drops of this. It honestly looked like a murder scene. Lastly, it's worth mentioning that despite this clay being incredibly red, at this point, this colour won't remain in the finished pieces. Instead it will turn a much darker black-red colour, which is a shame in some ways, as the intense tone of the stoneware at this point really is beautiful. So, in order to mix the clay for these pots, I'm just going to weigh out equal parts, which I'll then cut into many slices and then layer the two together. Now, the idea for these vessels is to create pots that are red, or crimson really. So we've got a red stoneware, there's a red glaze, and then I'm also going to wedge some bronze filings into the mix, which were given to me by Alex Pole, a blacksmith. As these contain mostly copper, these create small spots of essentially copper red glaze on the surface of the pot, and in a previous test with a green glaze, it worked really nicely, but I think the contrast between the red and the green is slightly too jarring. So in this test, it's going to be red on red on red, creating a surface that's hopefully a bit more coherent, as well as being quieter, a more metallic surface that's subtle in execution. That's the idea, at least. The next step is to blend all of this together. The bronze inclusions really just get swallowed up. I can barely feel them. And a cross section at this point shows how spiral wedging the two together gradually blends the body as the stonewares are forced into a spiral that gets smaller and smaller in the centre. It also looks surprisingly like sliced meat, and in theory you could stop and throw the clay at this point, which means you'd end up with a vessel with this marbling effect, but that isn't really my style. It takes a while to fully mix the two, and all the stain and oxide this body contains has completely overwhelmed the iron body that was added to it. But it does feel smoother, which means it'll be kinder to my hands when I start throwing on the wheel. For this test, I want to create 5 angular vessels. They aren't cups, but they could be seen as that, I suppose. Instead, I want to create a small sculptural group, so I weighed that mass out into 5 individual lumps, and then I give each one a quick pat and roll to fully combine all those weighed out pieces. Now, as I've already uploaded a video that shows the throwing and trimming of these, this will just be a quick recap, but if you would like to watch a much more thorough explanation of these processes, then I'll leave a link to that video on screen now and in the description below. But for the sake of this video, we're going to speed through it. Each of the shapes I'm making follow similar rules. They have to have a narrow base and an angular form, and are all thrown approximately to the same height. And even though this body has been mixed down by 50%, it being so grogged means they were really easy to throw, and the angles kept their shape fantastically. Grog, when added to a clay, adds strength and prevents things such as warping and cracking as it dries. It also makes the clay body shrink less, but it can provide some challenges, such as creating very delicate, smooth edges, as the grog, which is just pre-fired ceramic material that's been ground up, can overwhelm any thinly thrown sections, which means for things like the foot and the lip, I had to burnish them a tremendous amount, so the clay on these sections doesn't become rough and coarsely speckled, as the glaze wouldn't sit on these surfaces very well once fired. I couldn't really feel the bronze inclusions when throwing these pots, but I could certainly feel them scraping against the metal blade when trimming them. Sometimes they get caught and are dragged across the surface, leaving long gouges in the clay. It can't be avoided entirely, but if it does happen, I have to burnish and remove them, as otherwise the thin glaze that will eventually coat these pots might settle into them. The last thing I do is insert a round pot into the opening and twist it about a few times. This just ensures that the rim itself is lovely and round too. And for this process, I'm not using my tungsten carbide blades, as they tend to rip and tear through the clay, leaving a surface that looks scratched, whereas these steel tools, that are much more blunt, leave a surface that's burnished and smooth. I look at these pots as being made up from two parts. The lower section, that has to account for more or less half of the height, always tapers to a narrow foot, whereas the upper half can be thrown into whatever shape I like, but it has to be made up from a combination of straight planes. You can see one of the bronze filings here, and those that are more present on the surface, as opposed to being buried within the body, will ultimately melt into much larger specks of metal on the surface of these pots. I then burnish the foot, pressing the smooth side of this plastic kidney against it, which is especially important for the foot, as this is going to be the only part of exposed clay on the entire piece. And with these tests complete, I'll now set them aside so they can dry out slowly to bone dry. I'll also sling some plastic over them and seal them up rather tightly for a couple of days, as I've trimmed these pots to be very fine and light. And if I rush this drying process, or if they dry out from one side too quickly, their forms can distort and warp slightly. It's now a couple of weeks later, and the vases are now completely bone dry, meaning there's practically no moisture left inside them, save for a tiny amount that's still chemically bonded that will be driven away during the subsequent firings. At this stage, the pots are at their most fragile, and simply picking one up incorrectly can cause the pot to crack or the entire piece to shatter. So how pots are picked up and held and are placed inside the kiln at this point is an entire skill in itself. For this firing to 1000 degrees Celsius, the pots can touch. In fact, the denser the pack, the better, as it makes each firing more cost efficient. This kiln is fired automatically following a program I set. It's heated by elements in the walls, much like you'll have in a toaster, although these ones are much more powerful, and once the kiln has been fully packed, there's a lid on top which can be closed, which traps all the hot air in during the firing. During this process, as the pots are heated up gradually overnight, the clay chemically changes into ceramic, a material that's much harder, stronger, and also has a porous body, making each pot like a sponge, meaning the pots will be able to absorb water, which is a crucial aspect for the glazing process. Once full, the kiln is sealed up, and I remove the bung in this spy hole so any excess moisture and gas can escape. The power can then be switched on, the program set, the firing initiated. It's about 2 days later now, and the kiln is cool enough to unpack. The colour has faded already, but the pots are now strong enough to be picked up by the rim, as the particles that make up this clay body have begun to fuse. During the next glaze firing, which is to a hotter temperature, the clay body will fully vitrify, meaning that the clay body has completely fused, and water can no longer pass through it. The specks of bronze have already started to melt a tiny bit, but thankfully not enough to stick them to any of the other pots. Next on the list is waxing, which is perhaps the quickest and easiest job. Wax on the bottoms of the pots ensures that glaze won't adhere to them when they're dipped into it. If the bottom is glazed and is placed onto a kiln shelf and fired, the glaze melts, creates glass, and fuses the pot in place, meaning the pot has to be ripped off the kiln shelf or smashed off with a hammer, both of which result in damage to the vessel. In theory, you don't have to wax the bottoms of the pots. You can just glaze them entirely and then sponge off the excess, but I find this a touch quicker, and it ensures that I can get really nice, even lines around the bottoms of my pots, where the glaze meets the clay. For this process, the pots are tap-centered, which is a topic I just made a really thorough tutorial about, a link to which you can see on screen now, and I'll include another link in the description below. With the pot centered, wax is brushed over the entire base, creating a barrier that the water in the glaze won't be able to be pulled through, and therefore the raw materials that are mixed into the water cannot stick onto this waxed surface. This extra dab at the end is just to make sure my maker's mark is fully covered, as trying to dig the glaze out of that small indentation can be a pain. Now, I'm going to be using a new glaze for these pots, so I thought I'd take you through the process of how I mix up one of my glazes. This will be the bucket that the final glaze goes into, so I fill it about halfway up with water, and then I pour this water into a larger bucket, and it's in here that I'll measure out all the raw materials and do the mixing. For this entire process, I'll wear one of these masks. I also open the doors and windows in the studio to really ventilate the space. Wearing this means that I don't breathe in the very fine particles that are in the raw materials, such as the powdered quartz or very fine china clay. It can potentially give you silicosis if you breathe too much of it in over the years. And this is the glaze I'm going to be mixing up. It's relatively simple and goes on in a much thinner wash as compared to my usual felspathic crackle glazes that I use, which is a relief, as it means tidying these pots up after they've been glazed should be a much more straightforward process. The first thing I do is gather all the sacks of raw materials. And in a notebook, I have a list of the exact amount I need for each, which I'll tick off as I go and add them to the larger bucket, as it's incredibly easy to make a mistake or become distracted. And once these powders have been mixed, there's very little you can do to salvage them. So being accurate and double checking everything is crucial, as some raw materials can be really quite expensive. I'm starting with potash feldspar, which I dump into the water, and then I slide a wooden bat over the top to stop any more dust from escaping. This will be the glass former of the glaze. Next is china clay, or kaolin. This is a stiffener, and it should help stabilise the glaze, so it doesn't melt and move too much. Next comes a bit of dolomite, which will help create a silky, smooth surface to the glaze that's slightly matte. Next, there's red iron oxide, and it's this that will give the glaze its colour, as well as helping the glaze melt, as in reduction, it's a flux. And in this instance, I kid you not, there was the exact right amount left in the bag, 1050 grams precisely, which is just what I needed. I love when this happens. Lastly, there's some whiting, which is calcium carbonate, which is another flux. It also increases hardness and durability, and can produce a sort of matte surface. All of this is then thoroughly combined with a glaze mixer, and I like these wide buckets as the entire mixer can fit inside, slotting in right to the bottom. About 10 minutes later, I switch it off and tap off most of the excess glaze. The glaze itself was then passed through in a 100 mesh sieve, and this step is crucial as it fully combines everything, as without this there may be some larger particles that don't fully melt in the final glaze, resulting in specks and irregularities appearing in it. At this point I felt that it was still a touch thick, so I added a jug of water and mixed it again thoroughly. The glaze is then labelled and dated, and it's now ready to use. And then the studio's floor is given a really good mop. At this stage, with the pot's bases waxed and the glaze mixed, I can move on to dipping them into said glaze with a pair of tongs. After a few days, all the heavier material in here has settled to the bottom, so before it can be used, it's given a good mix. Each vessel is then held with a pair of tongs, submerged into the glaze for about 4 or 5 seconds. It's then taken out, the excess allowed to drip away, and then I rotate it around in place to try and get the droplets to settle evenly across the pot's shape. You can see here how the thin glaze flows off the wax, which means I have to spend less time tidying it up later. There is a lot I'm thinking about when glazing, such as how long each pot is dipped. These pieces have relatively thin walls, so I can't dip them for too long, otherwise the clay becomes oversaturated with water, resulting in the glaze taking a really long time to dry. And if that happens, there's a chance the glaze can crack and peel off the pot. Equally, if you tip it for too short a time, you can end up with a layer of glaze that's too thin, which most of the time results in a surface that's nothing like what you intended. So you do sort of have to find the sweet spot for your particular pots. And in this instance, as I'd never used this glaze on this scale before, this really was just a shot in the dark. This could be too thin, or it could be too thick. I'll have no way of knowing until I've fired them. The reason I'm blowing on the surface is that it pops all the tiny bubbles that appear as the glaze sinks into all those minute holes left over from where grog was torn out of them. The glazing still isn't quite finished though, as each pot now needs to be tidied up. I gently rub over the surface, especially where the tongue marks are, and the glaze dust that's removed through the abrasion is enough to fill and hide the tongue marks, as well as any other small inconsistencies in the surface. The last step is to sponge the base clean on each, so it looks something like this, after initially looking messy like this. This is another process where you have to be careful, as not only is the layer of glaze relatively fragile and can be chipped off if you knock it accidentally, but you can also rub away too much, creating a thin spot that will show in the finished fired piece. It's meticulous work, but it makes a big difference in the finished object, especially the foot. I want the line where clay and glaze meet to be finished to a really neat, even line all the way around. And with all these pieces now tidied up, bottoms cleaned and tongue marks removed, the process of packing them into the gas kiln can begin. And Christ, this caught me off guard. I have no idea how it got in there, considering this was placed the right way up and had been for months, unmoved. Due to these pots being quite thinly walled and delicate, I'm going to place them right in the centre of the pack. This way the flames won't be directly pummeling into them, and in this sheltered spot they should fire without warping, although I can't say that for sure. There are always surprises in this process. For this gas reduction firing, the pots cannot touch, otherwise the glaze that coats them will stick them together, so typically I leave about 2 to 3 millimeters between each. Yet I still want to pack the kiln as densely as possible, as not only does it of course make each firing more cost efficient, but it also makes firing in a reduction atmosphere easier, as there's less space for air to take up, as if there is a large open void within the pack. It can be tricky reducing it evenly. The kiln is lit at 7 AM, and the firing itself takes about 9 hours from beginning to end. And for the first couple of hours, I fire the kiln up very slowly, increasing the temperature gradually, as if you rush it, pots can explode potentially. Every half hour, I log the time, temperature, the gas pressure, the air pressure, and the damper position. This way, over multiple successful firings, I can home in on firing schedules that really work for me, and it also makes it easier to repeat firings, and also see potentially where things went wrong. For the early stages, I keep a mirror on the floor here, as one of my burners has a tendency to flicker out when it's on its lowest setting, and this just saves me from crouching down every 5 minutes to check. The temperature has risen slowly until I reach 860 degrees exactly. At this point, I can initiate reduction by increasing the gas pressure, the air pressure, and by half closing the dampers that cover the flues. This causes the atmosphere that's burning inside the chamber to do so inefficiently. There's simply not enough oxygen present for the gas to burn properly. And so, as a result, the burning atmosphere can find that oxygen from inside the clay and the glazes of the pots, stripping it away, changing the iron, thus creating colours that you can't quite achieve in the electric kiln I used previously. This kiln is also fired completely manually, unlike my electric kiln which can simply be programmed and set to run, whereas with this kiln I have to be there for every step, manually changing the settings, turning valves, and changing the position of the dampers. It's one of those processes that sounds scarier and more complicated than it really is. These days I can fire it practically without thinking. I simply follow old, successful firing charts, replicating the rise in temperature and initiating reduction at the right point. When cone 10 has bent over at approximately 1290 degrees Celsius, the kiln can be switched off, the firing finally finished. The last thing I do is take the bungs out of the spy holes and I fully open the damper, and from this point I let it crash cool back down to 1000 degrees Celsius. This helps to retain colour and gloss. It's then fully closed up and allowed to cool down slowly for a couple of days. It's rare that I'm this excited to unpack a kiln load of work. After firing so many times with work you know will be more or less successful, those firings that contain lots of tests become the ones you really look forward to. There were a few disasters, some cruel pots and some glazes that didn't really work out, but I could just about make out the crimson pots from here, and I think they look pretty good. I'll need to pick them up before I can really pass any judgment. They're lovely in light, and the surface is packed full of interest. And the bronze in this state is definitely more subtle than it was before. Those rings of red just fade into the crimson body. The one thing that seems to have happened is that the crimson clay is plucked away quite a bit from the kiln shelf, resulting in backwash being stuck onto the pots like this, and in some other cases some of the black clay on the foot has been torn out, but I should be able to fix it by sanding them. Either way, that's something I'm going to have to figure out when I try this combination next. I may have to fire them on a thin layer of coarse alumina hydrate. This way there's something a bit more substantial that separates the pots from the shelf, but for the moment I'm just going to sand the bottom of each with one of these diamond pads. And that's these pots at long last finished. Now to have a real proper look at them. It's another one of those surfaces where I'm sure in video it's not going to look quite how they feel in person. They're quite reflective vessels, so the surface they're placed on is important, and I think in the long run, when I exhibit these, they'll have to be placed on a non-reflective surface, so you don't get quite so much glaring. The crimson glaze really is quite metallic. It isn't simply a flat red tone either. It's full of interest, even if you discard the bronze flecks. In future tests, when I make larger pots with this mix, I'm going to scale back the amount of bronze used. As whilst I do really love how they look, I think there's just slightly too many, making the pots look too spotty. Although under a macro lens they really are incredible. You can still make out the red ring around the lump of metal in the centre, although compare that to how it looked on the green glaze, and it's worlds apart. Either way, I'm really happy with these, and I'd love to know what you think. These aren't made to be functional pots, their use really is to be displayed in a row like this, although picking them up and looking at all the detail is half of the fun, I suppose. I may try and figure out how to make this glaze slightly less reflective. If it was just a touch more matte, the crimson tone that covers these pots may stand out just a bit more, as at the moment the colour of them really depends on the light and surface they're shot on. For instance, in this case, they take on more of the blue tone from their surrounding. The clay body itself is lovely. It's smooth to the touch after being sanded, and it is perhaps slightly darker than what I envisioned, but I adore all the gritty details it has. The specks of metal, the grog, the crimson undertone. I can't wait to make some bigger pots with this mix, and if that is something you'd like to see, do let me know. But until then, thank you so much for taking your time to watch, and as always, I'll see you next time.